People think the criminal underworld operates strictly in the shadows, but the truth is, monsters bleed under the harsh, flickering, fluorescent lights of late-night diners, just like the rest of us. When a bleeding man with a loaded Beretta crashed into my kitchen, I didn't scream. I grabbed a dirty bar towel and pressed it to his chest. That single terrifying decision didn't just save a cartel boss's life. It fundamentally, violently rewrote the rest of mine. The rain in South Philadelphia wasn't the poetic, cleansing kind. It was greasy, freezing, and smelled distinctly of exhaust fumes and rotting garbage. At 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the streets were entirely dead, save for the flickering neon sign of the iron skillet, throwing a sickly red glow onto the wet asphalt. Savannah Hayes was exhausted. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, and her feet, swollen inside her worn-out New Balance sneakers, felt like they were on fire. At 250 pounds, Savannah was a big woman, a fact the world never let her forget. She took up space in a society that constantly demanded women shrink themselves. But in the kitchen of the diner, her size was her armor. She was strong, capable of hauling 50-pound sacks of flour without asking for help, and her thick thighs and broad hips gave her a sturdy center of gravity when navigating the treacherous, grease-slicked line during the Sunday morning rush. She was wiping down the stainless steel prep tables with a rag soaked in industrial bleach when the heavy metal back door, the one with the deadbolt that always stuck, violently smashed open. The sound was like a bomb going off in the quiet kitchen. Savannah flinched, dropping the rag, her heart immediately seizing in her chest. A man practically fell through the threshold, catching himself on the doorframe. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked to the bone. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that was ruined by the rain, but more prominently by the massive, spreading stain of dark crimson blooming across his abdomen. He took one step into the kitchen, his leather shoes slipping on the wet floor, and collapsed to his knees. Savannah stood frozen. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run out the front door, to flag down a patrol car, to scream. But she didn't. She stared at the man. His head hung low, dark hair plastered to his forehead. His breathing was a wet, ragged wheeze. "Lock it," he rasped, his voice a gravelly baritone that vibrated through the quiet room. He didn't look up, but his right hand twitched. That was when Savannah saw the dull, matte black finish of a suppressed handgun gripped loosely in his fingers. Terror, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her shock. She moved before she could overthink it, rushing past him to the heavy steel door. She slammed it shut, throwing her entire weight against it, and shoved the stubborn deadbolt into place until it clicked. She turned back to him. He had slumped completely onto his side, his breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. Blood was pooling on the faded checkerboard linoleum, a terrifying amount of it. "Hey," Savannah said, her voice shaking. "Hey, you're bleeding out. I have to call an ambulance. Thomas Jefferson University Hospital is only 10 minutes away." "No hospitals," he ground out, his head rolling back to look at her. Savannah sucked in a breath. Even pale, sweating, and dying, the man was strikingly handsome. He had a strong, aristocratic jawline, a broken nose that had healed slightly crooked, and eyes so dark they looked like endless, empty voids. It was a brutal, terrifying kind of beauty. This wasn't a mugging victim. This was a predator who had been caught out of his territory. "You're going to die on my floor," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. "I've survived worse," he whispered, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips, before a violent cough racked his body, bringing a splatter of blood to his lips. "Patch me up, or let me die, but no cops." Savannah hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She was a waitress, not a trauma surgeon. But she had grown up in a rough neighborhood. She knew what happened to people who called the cops on the wrong kind of men. They didn't just kill you. They burned your life to the ground. "If you shoot me," Savannah muttered, moving toward the supply closet, "I'm going to haunt you." She returned with a terrifyingly inadequate first aid kit, a bottle of high-proof rubbing alcohol, a roll of silver duct tape, and a stack of clean white bar towels. She dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, he smelled of expensive cedarwood cologne, copper, and rain. "I have to open your shirt," she said. He didn't answer. He had passed out. Savannah worked quickly. Her hands, thick and calloused from years of hard labor, were surprisingly gentle as she ripped open his blood-soaked dress shirt. The bullet had entered his lower right side, just above the hip bone. It was an ugly, jagged hole, pulsing sluggishly with dark blood. She poured the rubbing alcohol directly into the wound. The man, even unconscious, jerked violently, a low, guttural groan tearing from his throat. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, and his hand shot out, wrapping around Savannah's thick wrist with the crushing force of a steel vice. "Easy," Savannah hushed, her voice dropping to a low, soothing cadence. She didn't pull away, though his grip was bruising her flesh. "It's me, the fat waitress. You're in my kitchen. I'm stopping the bleeding." He blinked, his vision clearing as he looked up at her. His gaze drifted over her round face, the messy bun of frizzy brown hair on top of her head, and the soft, heavy curve of her breasts pressing against her stained apron. He didn't look at her with the disgust or dismissal she was used to from men who looked like him. He looked at her like she was the only real thing in the room. "What's your name?" he gasped, his grip on her wrist loosening, his thumb weakly stroking the sensitive skin of her inner arm. "Savannah," she said, pressing a thick wad of towels into his side. "Keep the pressure on this. Do it." He weakly pressed his hand over hers. She taped the towels down tightly, wrapping the silver duct tape entirely around his waist, lifting his heavy torso to secure it. It was a butcher's job, but the bleeding slowed. For the next 4 hours, Savannah sat on the cold floor with the stranger. She brought him water, which he drank greedily. She learned his name was Roman, just Roman. He didn't ask her about her weight, didn't make a snide comment when she grunted with effort while helping him sit up against the stainless steel cabinets. Instead, his dark eyes followed her every movement, cataloguing her, studying her with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. At 5:30 a.m., the rain finally stopped. Roman forced himself to his feet. He was pale as a ghost, swaying slightly, but his eyes were hard. "You saved my life, Savannah," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled a heavy, blood-stained money clip from his pocket and tossed it onto the prep table. It landed with a heavy thud. It was a thick stack of $100 bills. "I don't want your money," she said, taking a step back. "Just go, please, before the morning prep cook gets here." Roman looked at the money, then at her. A strange, unreadable emotion flickered in his dark eyes. He didn't take the cash back. "This isn't over," he said softly. He slipped out the back door, disappearing into the pre-dawn fog, leaving Savannah alone with a puddle of blood, a stack of illegal cash, and the terrifying realization that her life had just jumped off the tracks. Scrubbing human blood out of linoleum is a uniquely horrifying task. Savannah spent the next 2 hours on her hands and knees, scrubbing until her fingernails cracked and the heavy scent of bleach burned her lungs. By the time her prep cook, a quiet older man named Hector, arrived at 7 a.m., the kitchen smelled like a hospital, but the floor was clean. The money clip, which held exactly $10,000, was hidden in the bottom of her purse, tucked beneath a mountain of receipts and loose tampons. She felt radioactive just carrying it. The morning rush was brutal. Savannah's feet screamed in protest as she carried towering stacks of pancakes, endless mugs of black coffee, and plates of greasy hash browns to the regulars. She plastered on her usual warm, dimpled smile, joking with the construction workers and the hung-over college students. But inside, her stomach was tied in agonizing knots. Every time the bell above the diner door jingled, her heart stopped, expecting to see police officers, or worse, the men who had put a bullet in Roman. At 11 a.m., the bell jingled, but it wasn't a cop or a hitman. It was worse. It was Gary Henderson, the landlord of the building. Gary was a slimy, balding man who wore cheap suits and looked at Savannah with a mixture of pity and predatory greed. He slid into a booth, tapping his gold watch. Savannah wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, a knot of dread forming in her throat. "Gary," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Coffee?" "I don't want coffee, Savannah. I want the rent," Gary said, his voice loud enough for the two booths over to hear. He smiled, a nasty, thin stretching of his lips. "You're 3 months behind. That's $15,000. I've been patient. I've been nice. But you're running a failing business in a gentrifying neighborhood." "I have the money," Savannah blurted out, her mind flashing to the blood-stained bills in her purse. "I can give you $10,000 right now, in cash. I'll have the rest by Friday." Gary raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but then he shook his head, leaning back against the red vinyl booth. "No, Savannah. I don't want partial payments anymore. In fact, I don't want your money at all. I have a buyer for the block. They want to tear this dump down and build luxury condos. I'm serving you a 30-day eviction notice." He pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and dropped it onto the table. Savannah felt all the blood drain from her face. The iron skillet wasn't just a diner. It was her entire life. She had inherited the mountain of debt from her late father. She had sacrificed her 20s, her health, and her peace of mind to keep the grill hot. "Gary, you can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I have the cash." 30 days, sweetheart. Maybe you can use that cash to buy a gym membership," he sneered, looking pointedly at her thick waistline. Savannah stood frozen, humiliation and rage burning hot behind her eyes as Gary stood up to leave. But Gary didn't make it to the door. 3 black Lincoln Navigators, their windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors, pulled violently into the diner's small parking lot, blocking Gary's beat-up Lexus. The diner fell dead silent. Even the sizzle of the grill seemed to mute itself. 4 men stepped out of the vehicles. They didn't look like local thugs. They wore tailored, dark navy suits, pristine white shirts, and silk ties. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying precision. The front door opened. A man in his early 50s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses walked in, flanked by 2 men who were built like freight trains. The silver-haired man carried a slim leather briefcase. He didn't look at the customers. He walked directly up to Gary Henderson. "Are you Gary Henderson?" the man asked. His voice was polite, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of warmth. "Yeah. Who's asking?" Gary puffed out his chest, though his voice wavered. "My name is Thomas Albright. I represent Vanguard Holdings, LLC," the lawyer said. He opened his briefcase right there on a vacant table. "My client is purchasing this building, the lot it sits on, and the 3 adjacent properties. We are prepared to offer you 3 times the market value, in cash, today." Gary's eyes bugged out of his head. 3 times? I already have a buyer. One of the massive men standing behind Albright took a single half step forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his hands. But the sheer, suffocating menace rolling off him made Gary swallow his words instantly. "The other buyer has formally withdrawn their offer as of 10 minutes ago," Albright said smoothly, sliding a stack of crisp legal documents across the table. "I suggest you sign, Mr. Henderson. My client is a very generous man, but he is notoriously impatient." Gary, sweating profusely, pulled a pen from his pocket and signed the papers with a shaking hand. Albright handed him a cashier's check that made Gary gasp out loud. Without another word, Gary practically ran out of the diner. Albright calmly gathered the papers, closed his briefcase, and finally turned his attention to Savannah. She was clutching her order pad to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Albright walked up to her, his expression softening just a fraction. "Miss Hayes?" he asked.
Yes?"
Albright reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. He handed it to her. "My employer instructed me to handle the landlord issue. He also instructed me to give you this," Albright said. "The deed to the building, fully transferred into your name, completely free of any liens or mortgages. The diner is yours, Miss Hayes. Permanently." Savannah stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. "Who is your employer?" Albright smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "A man who pays his debts. Good day, Miss Hayes." The men in suits walked out as quickly and quietly as they had entered. The navigators pulled away, disappearing down the street. Savannah stood in the middle of her packed diner, holding the deed to a $2 million piece of real estate, realizing with a cold spike of dread that the bleeding man from the kitchen didn't just pay her back. He had bought her. For exactly 7 days, Savannah lived in a state of suspended animation. She waited for the other shoe to drop. She waited for the police to kick down her door. She waited for the hit men to finish what they started. But nothing happened. The diner thrived. With no rent to pay and her father's debts magically wiped clean by an anonymous wire transfer, Savannah actually started turning a profit. For the first time in her life, she wasn't drowning, but the silence was deafening. Every time she looked at the heavy, reinforced back door of her kitchen, she remembered the smell of his blood, the violent strength of his grip on her wrist, and the dark, obsessive intensity in his eyes. Roman. She tried searching the internet for his name, matching it with organized crime in the Northeast. It didn't take long. Roman Castelli, the undisputed head of the Castelli crime family, controlling the docks, the unions, and the underground casinos from Philadelphia to Atlantic City. He was a ghost to law enforcement, a myth in the streets, and currently the subject of a brutal turf war with the Doherty brothers, a ruthless Irish syndicate trying to push into his territory. And Savannah had his blood on her floor. On the 8th night, the shoe finally dropped. It was past closing. Savannah was alone, locking up the cash register. The lights in the dining room were dimmed. The front door unlocked with a sharp click. Savannah froze. She had locked it herself 20 minutes ago. The door opened, and Roman Castelli walked in. He looked entirely different from the dying man in her kitchen. He was dressed immaculately in a dark navy custom-tailored Brioni suit that draped flawlessly over his broad, muscular frame. There was no limp, no hesitation in his stride. He radiated absolute, terrifying authority. He locked the door behind him and flipped the closed sign. "You changed the locks," Roman noted, his voice smooth and dark, echoing in the empty diner. "You bought my building," Savannah shot back, surprising herself with her venom. Her hands were shaking, but she refused to back down. She stood behind the counter, planting her heavy curves firmly. "I didn't ask for that. I don't want your blood money." Roman walked slowly toward the counter. He moved like a panther, silent, lethal, and entirely focused on his prey. He stopped just on the other side of the laminate counter, mere inches from her. He smelled of that same cedarwood cologne. But this time, there was no copper. "It's not blood money, Gatina," Roman said softly, his dark eyes trailing over her face, down the thick, soft curve of her neck, to the heavy swell of her cleavage straining against her apron. His gaze was heavy, heated, and completely unapologetic. "It's a gift. You saved my life. I protect what's mine." "I'm not yours," Savannah snapped, her face flushing crimson under his stare. Men didn't look at her like this. They looked at her with polite indifference or crude mockery. Roman looked at her like he wanted to devour her. "You are," he corrected, his tone entirely casual, as if stating a fundamental law of physics. He reached across the counter. Savannah tried to step back, but he was faster. His large, warm hand cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "I've been watching you, Savannah. For the last week, I watched you hustle in this diner. I watched you smile at men who don't deserve the air you breathe. I watched how beautifully soft you are." Savannah's breath hitched. She couldn't move. The sheer magnetism of the man was paralyzing. "You need to leave. If the police work for me," Roman interrupted quietly. He stepped around the counter, invading her space. Savannah was a big woman, but Roman made her feel small. He caged her against the cash register, his hands resting on the counter on either side of her wide hips. "Then what are you doing here?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Roman's expression darkened, the charming predator replaced by a cold, calculating killer. "I'm here because we have a problem. The Doherty brothers." Savannah swallowed hard. "The ones who shot you?" Roman nodded slowly. "Liam Doherty knows I survived, and he knows I didn't go to a hospital. My men swept the alleyway out back. They cleaned the blood, but Doherty's rats are sniffing around this neighborhood. They're looking for the good Samaritan who put me back together." A cold sweat broke out on the back of Savannah's neck. "They know about me?" "Not yet," Roman said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. She shivered violently as his hot breath hit her skin. "But they will, which is why I'm moving my base of operations. Here." Savannah pushed violently against his chest. It was like pushing a brick wall, but he willingly took a half step back, allowing her to breathe. "What?" "No, absolutely not. You cannot bring a Mafia war into my diner." "It's already here," Roman said coldly. "If I leave you unprotected, Liam Doherty will string you up by your beautiful thick thighs and peel the skin from your bones until you tell him where I am. You're involved now, Savannah. The only way you survive is under my absolute protection." "By turning my restaurant into a mob hideout?" she cried out, panic rising in her throat. "By turning your VIP back room into my private office," Roman corrected. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing the side of her heavy breast. Savannah gasped, her body betraying her with a violent, electric jolt of arousal that shocked her. Roman smirked, a dark, victorious look in his eyes. "You saved a monster, Savannah," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Now, you have to live with him." Before she could process his words, the heavy shatter of glass exploded from the front of the diner. A Molotov cocktail sailed through the front window, landing squarely in the middle of the dining room. The glass shattered, and a brilliant, roaring wall of orange fire erupted into the air, instantly catching the vinyl booths and the cheap curtains. Roman didn't hesitate. He tackled Savannah to the floor, just as a hail of automatic gunfire tore through the front of the restaurant, shredding the walls and turning her safe haven into a terrifying war zone. The heat was immediate and suffocating. The air inside the diner vanished, replaced by thick, acrid black smoke and the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. Roman's heavy body covered Savannah completely, pressing her flush against the greasy linoleum behind the laminate counter. His hand was buried in her thick hair, shielding her head as bullets shredded the espresso machine above them, raining scalding water and jagged shrapnel down on his broad back. He didn't even flinch. "Stay down!" Roman roared over the deafening noise. He rolled off her just enough to draw the heavy Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster. "My diner!" Savannah screamed, coughing violently as the smoke burned her lungs. Through the haze, she could see the flames crawling up the vintage cherry-red vinyl booths her father had installed 20 years ago. The walls were weeping fire. Everything she owned, everything she had broken her back to build, was turning into ash. "Forget the diner! Move!" Roman grabbed the thick fabric of her apron, hauling her to her feet with terrifying, effortless strength. He didn't pull her toward the burning dining room. He shoved her backward into the narrow, smoke-filled corridor leading to the kitchen. The kitchen doors swung wildly as a fresh volley of bullets tore through the front windows. Wood splintered and glass rained down like hail. Savannah's lungs burned, her vision blurring. But the sheer primal instinct to survive propelled her forward. Her heavy thighs pumped as she sprinted past the stainless steel prep tables, the very spot where she had saved this man's life a week ago. "The back door!" she gasped, her chest heaving. "The deadbolt sticks!" Roman didn't slow down. "Get behind me." He stepped in front of her, raising his weapon. He fired 3 rapid, deafening shots into the heavy brass locking mechanism of the steel door. The metal screamed, buckling under the force. Roman took 1 step back and delivered a brutal, shattering kick to the door. It burst open, flying off its broken hinges and slamming into the brick wall of the alleyway. The cold night air hit them, sweet and freezing. But the alley wasn't empty. 2 men in dark tactical gear were sprinting toward the rear exit, assault rifles raised. Roman moved with a lethal, fluid grace that terrified Savannah down to her marrow. He shoved her hard behind a rusted industrial dumpster and stepped directly into the line of fire. He didn't take cover. He simply raised his gun and fired twice. 2 clean, muffled pops. Both men dropped like stones, their blood mingling with the muddy puddles in the alleyway. "Move!" Roman barked, his eyes scanning the rooftops. He grabbed her hand, his long, calloused fingers intertwining tightly with hers, and dragged her down the alley. They burst out onto the adjacent street, just as 2 black, armored Cadillac Escalades screeched to a halt at the curb, their tires smoking. The doors flew open. Savannah recognized one of the men who stepped out, Vincent, a towering, brutal-looking man with a scarred jawline who had accompanied the lawyer earlier that week. "Boss!" Vincent yelled, raising a submachine gun and aiming it down the street toward the front of the diner. "Get her in the car," Roman ordered, shoving Savannah toward the open back door of the lead SUV. "No, wait!" Savannah clawed at the doorframe, turning her head to look back. The iron skillet was a blazing inferno. Flames licked high into the Philadelphia night sky, consuming the neon sign that had flickered outside her window since she was a child. The glass shattered outward in a violent explosion of heat, throwing sparks across the pavement. Fire trucks were wailing in the distance, but it was too late. It was all gone. Tears, hot and fast, tracked through the black soot on her cheeks. Her knees buckled under the weight of the devastation. Roman stepped up behind her. He wrapped his massive arms around her thick waist, pulling her back against his chest. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. "I will rebuild it," he whispered directly into her ear, his voice a dark, violent promise over the roar of the fire. "Brick by brick. Better than it was. But right now, you belong to me, and I am getting you out of here. Get in the car, Savannah." He didn't give her a choice. He lifted her easily, placing her in the back seat of the Escalade, and slid in right beside her. The doors slammed shut, enclosing them in the heavy, leather-scented silence of the armored cabin. The SUV tore away from the curb, leaving Savannah's entire past burning in the rearview mirror. She sat frozen, her chest heaving, staring at her soot-stained, trembling hands. She was a waitress. She worried about wholesale egg prices and fixing the walk-in freezer. She didn't dodge bullets. Roman reached over, gently taking her shaking hands in his. He pulled a pristine white silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and began, methodically, to wipe the soot from her knuckles. "Liam Doherty just signed his own death warrant," Roman said quietly, his eyes fixed on her trembling fingers. "But you are safe. No one will ever touch you. I swear it on my life." Savannah looked at him, seeing the cold, absolute murder in his dark eyes, and realized with a sickening lurch of her stomach that the danger wasn't just behind them in the flames. She was sitting right next to it. Roman's safe house was not a house. It was a fortress disguised as a sprawling, Gilded Age mansion, hidden behind 20-foot wrought-iron gates deep in the woods of Villanova. For 3 days, Savannah was locked inside a velvet prison. The bedroom she had been given was larger than her entire apartment. It had vaulted ceilings, a massive mahogany 4-poster bed, and a private balcony overlooking acres of manicured, heavily guarded gardens. Her closet had been stocked overnight with expensive silk robes, soft cashmere sweaters, and dresses tailored perfectly to her lush, heavy curves. But she couldn't leave. Men with earpieces and concealed weapons stood at every exit. Roman came to her every night. He didn't push her, didn't force himself into her bed, but his presence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He would sit in the armchair in the corner of her room, pouring her expensive bourbon, watching her eat the gourmet meals his private chef prepared. He was obsessed. He watched the way she moved, the way the silk robes clung to her wide hips and heavy breasts. He praised her softness, violently cursing the men in her past who had ever made her feel less than a goddess. He was intoxicating, dangerous, and completely overwhelming. Savannah felt herself slowly drowning in him, terrified of how much she was beginning to crave his dark, obsessive attention. But on the 4th afternoon, the illusion of safety cracked. Roman had left the estate to meet with his capos, leaving Vincent in charge of the security detail. Savannah, restless and suffocating in her beautiful cage, wandered out of her room. The guards allowed her to roam the interior of the mansion, mostly ignoring her as she paced the echoing marble hallways. She found herself in the east wing, near Roman's private study, a room she had been explicitly told to avoid. The heavy oak door was cracked open just an inch. Savannah paused, intending to turn around, when she heard a familiar voice murmuring urgently from within. It was Lorenzo, Roman's smooth-talking, fiercely loyal second-in-command. He had been the one to bring Savannah her new clothes. He had smiled at her, kissed her knuckles, and called her the savior of the family. "I told you, Doherty, it's not that simple," Lorenzo hissed, his voice tight with panic. Savannah froze. Doherty. The name hit her like a physical blow. Liam Doherty. The man who had burned down her diner. The man trying to kill Roman. She pressed her back against the cold wall, holding her breath, inching closer to the crack in the door. "Castelli has the place locked down tighter than Fort Knox," Lorenzo continued, pacing the study. "I can't just leave the gates open. Vincent checks the perimeter every hour, but I can disable the camera feed on the north wall tonight at midnight. You have a 10-minute window to get your men over the fence. If you screw this up, Roman will skin me alive." A pause as Lorenzo listened to the voice on the other end of the burner phone. "I don't care about the fat girl," Lorenzo snapped viciously, his handsome face twisting into a sneer. "Shoot her. Burn her. I don't give a damn. She's a distraction. Roman is completely blinded by her. It makes him weak. Just get in here and put a bullet in his head so I can take over the territory. Midnight. Don't be late." Lorenzo ended the call and snapped the burner phone in half, tossing the pieces into the fireplace. Savannah couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. Lorenzo was the mole. He was the one who had tipped Doherty off about the diner. He was the reason her life was in ashes. And tonight, he was going to let an army of killers into the mansion. She had to warn Roman. She took a slow, agonizing step backward, desperate to slip away unnoticed. But her thick thigh brushed against a heavy, antique porcelain vase sitting on a pedestal near the door. The vase wobbled. Savannah lunged to catch it, but she was a fraction of a second too late. It hit the marble floor with a resounding, catastrophic crash that echoed through the entire wing. Dead silence fell over the study. Savannah didn't wait. She hiked up the skirt of her heavy cashmere dress and bolted down the hallway, her bare feet slapping wildly against the cold marble. "Hey!" Lorenzo shouted, the study door flying open behind her. "Stop her!" Savannah ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning, her mind racing. She needed to find Vincent. She needed a phone. She needed to survive. But as she rounded the corner toward the main staircase, two massive guards, men she had never seen before, stepped into the hallway, blocking her path entirely. They weren't Roman's men. They were Lorenzo's. Lorenzo's footsteps slowed as he rounded the corner behind her. He walked up slowly, a cold, dead look in his eyes, pulling a suppressed pistol from his waistband. "Well," Lorenzo sighed, leveling the barrel directly at Savannah's chest. "Looks like midnight came early." The heavy silence of the Villanova estate shattered the moment Lorenzo raised the suppressed Kimber 1911. The matte black barrel looked like a bottomless pit, pointed directly at the center of Savannah's chest. "Nothing personal, sweetheart," Lorenzo murmured, his handsome face twisting into a mask of pure, ambitious malice. "You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Twice." Savannah didn't have a gun. She didn't have tactical training, but she had grown up off Passyunk Avenue in South Philly, dealing with belligerent drunks and men twice her size. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She wasn't going to die cowering in a cashmere dress. As Lorenzo's finger tightened on the trigger, Savannah didn't step backward. She threw her entire 250-pound frame forward. She slammed her shoulder directly into the chest of the guard, standing to Lorenzo's left. The sheer force of her momentum caught the massive man off guard. His heavy combat boots slipped on the polished marble floor, and he crashed backward into Lorenzo just as the gun discharged. Pfft! The bullet whipped past Savannah's ear, the supersonic crack deafening in the narrow hallway, and buried itself into the antique mahogany wainscoting behind her. Before Lorenzo could regain his footing and realign his weapon, the heavy oak double doors at the end of the corridor violently burst open. Roman Castelli stood in the threshold. He had shed his suit jacket. His white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the edge of the silver duct tape Savannah had applied days ago. But he didn't look like a wounded man. He looked like the devil himself, summoned straight from the lowest circle of hell. Behind him, looming like a grim reaper, was Vincent, an FN Scar assault rifle already leveled at the guards. "Drop it!" Roman's voice wasn't a yell. It was a terrifying, guttural command that vibrated the very air in the hallway. Lorenzo froze. The two guards immediately raised their hands, their weapons clattering to the marble floor. But Lorenzo, panic flashing wildly in his eyes, gripped the kimber tighter. He looked from Roman to Savannah, rapidly calculating his odds. "Boss," Lorenzo stammered, his smooth voice cracking. "She was snooping in your study. She's a rat for Doherty." "He's lying!" Savannah screamed, her chest heaving as she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall. "He's the mole, Roman. I heard him on a burner phone. He gave Doherty the diner. And he's shutting off the cameras on the north wall tonight at midnight. He's letting them in." Roman's dark eyes flicked to Lorenzo. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Is that right, Enzo?" Roman asked softly, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. Lorenzo's hand shook. He knew he was a dead man. In a desperate, blinding panic, he swung the gun toward Savannah. "If I'm dead, she comes with—" Roman moved with a terrifying, explosive speed that defied his recent injuries. He didn't bother drawing his own weapon. He lunged, closing the distance in a fraction of a second, and grabbed Lorenzo's wrist. With a sickening, wet crack, Roman snapped the man's arm backward. Lorenzo shrieked, the kimber dropping to the floor. Roman didn't stop. He drove his knee brutally into Lorenzo's abdomen, folding the traitor in half, before grabbing him by the throat and slamming him violently against the marble wall. The heavy thud echoed through the wing. Roman pulled a slim, viciously curved Microtech halo out the front knife from his pocket. The blade snapped out with a metallic snick. "You burned her diner," Roman whispered, the blade resting directly against Lorenzo's carotid artery. "You terrified my woman, and you thought you could take my city." "Roman, please," Lorenzo choked out, blood bubbling on his lips. "Vincent," Roman said smoothly, not taking his eyes off Lorenzo. "Take the two guards to the basement. I want to know exactly how many men Doherty is bringing. Extract the information. You have 10 minutes. "Yes, boss," Vincent grunted, gesturing with the rifle for the two terrified guards to move. Roman leaned closer to Lorenzo. "You should have stayed loyal, Enzo. The Irish won't sing songs about you." Savannah turned her face away, pressing her hands over her ears as Roman drove the blade upward. A wet, tearing sound was followed by a heavy slump as Lorenzo's lifeless body slid down the marble wall, pooling blood onto the pristine floor. Savannah was shaking violently. Her breath came in short, hyperventilating gasps. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the metallic scent of copper that suddenly filled the air, the same scent from the night she met him. Heavy, warm hands gently gripped her shoulders. She opened her eyes. Roman was standing in front of her. His hands were covered in Lorenzo's blood, but he was incredibly careful not to let it touch her clothes. His dark eyes were entirely stripped of the violent monster that had just executed a man seconds prior. They were soft, anchored, and entirely focused on her. "Look at me, Gatina," he commanded gently. Savannah forced her gaze up to his face. He was going to let them in. "They're coming to kill you." "They are going to try," Roman corrected, his thumb lightly brushing her collarbone, a stark contrast to the violence he had just committed. "You were incredibly brave. You threw your weight against them. You saved my life. Again." "I'm terrified," she admitted, tears finally spilling over her thick lashes. "I just wanted to run a diner, Roman. I don't belong in a war." Roman's jaw tightened. "You belong with me, and tonight I am going to end this war so you can have your life back. But I need you to be brave for just a little longer." "What time did he say?" Savannah swallowed hard, looking at the grandfather clock at the end of the hall. "Midnight. 10-minute window." It was 11:15 p.m. "Good," Roman said, a dark, lethal smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a predator who had just been handed the keys to the slaughterhouse. "Then we have exactly 45 minutes to prepare a very warm Italian welcome for Mr. Doherty." Roman turned to the corridor. "Rossi!" he bellowed. A lean, sharp-eyed enforcer stepped out of the shadows. "Boss, lock the estate down, but leave the north wall cameras on a continuous loop of empty footage," Roman ordered, his voice slipping into the cold, calculated cadence of a military general. "Arm every man in the house. Suppressors on all weapons. We don't want the Villanova Police Department crashing our party. Doherty is walking into a trap." Roman turned back to Savannah. He didn't send her away to hide. He pulled her flush against his chest, regardless of the blood, wrapping his arms securely around her thick, trembling waist. "Come with me," he murmured into her hair. "We are going to the safe room. You will watch on the monitors as I burn Liam Doherty's empire to the ground." The safe room was located deep within the center of the mansion, heavily fortified behind reinforced steel and biometric locks. It was lined with high-definition monitors, displaying every inch of the estate's sprawling grounds. Savannah sat in a plush leather chair, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders, nursing a glass of 20-year-old Macallan Scotch Roman had forced into her trembling hands. It was 11:58 p.m. Roman stood behind her, his hands resting possessively on her shoulders. He was fully armed now, wearing a tactical Kevlar vest over a black Henley shirt, a customized Sig Sauer strapped to his thigh, and an M4 carbine slung across his broad back. "There," Roman pointed to the top left monitor. On the screen, the iron gates of the north wall loomed in the grainy night vision green. At exactly midnight, the shadows shifted. 6 unmarked black vans cut their headlights and rolled silently to a stop against the perimeter wall. Over 30 heavily armed men spilled out, dressed in tactical gear. They carried breaching tools, bolt cutters, and assault rifles. At the center of the group was Liam Doherty, a tall, red-headed man with a thick beard and a ruthless reputation on the streets of South Philly. "He came himself," Roman noted softly, his fingers digging slightly into Savannah's shoulders. "Arrogant." On the monitors, Doherty's men clipped the heavy padlocks on the maintenance gate. Lorenzo had given them the exact codes to bypass the secondary alarms. They moved with military precision, flooding into the manicured gardens, heading straight for the rear patio of the east wing. They thought they were ghosts. They had no idea they were walking directly into a kill box. "Wait for it," Roman whispered into his radio headset. His voice was chillingly calm. Savannah watched, her heart in her throat, as Doherty's men stacked up against the heavy glass doors of the patio. Doherty raised his hand, holding up 3 fingers, counting down the breach. 3, 2, 1. "Now!" Roman commanded. The estate erupted. From the second-story balconies, the roof lines, and the dense hedges of the rose garden, Roman's men opened fire. Because every weapon was suppressed, there was no deafening roar, only the terrifying rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip of high-velocity rounds tearing through the night. Doherty's front line was decimated instantly. Men dropped like stones onto the imported Italian terracotta tiles, blood pooling black in the night vision cameras. Panic ensued. The Irish syndicate returned fire, but they were shooting blindly into the darkness, completely exposed in the open garden. "They're falling back to the tree line," Vincent's voice crackled over Roman's earpiece. "Cut them off! Rossi, take the flank!" Roman ordered. He squeezed Savannah's shoulders one last time, pressing a hard, heated kiss to the top of her head. "Do not open this door for anyone but me." Before she could protest, Roman was gone, the heavy steel door sealing shut with a pneumatic hiss. Savannah was left alone in the glowing green light of the monitors. She watched in horrified fascination as the tactical ballet of death unfolded. Roman's men were surgical. They funneled Doherty's remaining forces toward the drained decorative fountain in the center of the lawn, a complete dead end. Suddenly, Camera 4 switched to static. Then Camera 6. Doherty's men were shooting out the surveillance. Savannah gripped the arms of her chair. The monitors showing the rear patio went dark. She couldn't see Roman. She couldn't see if he was safe. Outside, the reality was a brutal, close-quarters bloodbath. Roman moved through the shadows of his own home like a ghost. He didn't rely on his rifle in the tight corridors of the East Wing, where Doherty had managed to breach 2 of his top enforcers. Roman took them out with lethal, terrifying efficiency. 2 shots to the chest, 1 to the head. He stepped out onto the shattered glass of the patio. The air smelled of cordite, torn earth, and blood. Near the stone balustrade, Liam Doherty was bleeding heavily from a gunshot wound to his thigh, desperately trying to reload his weapon. His men were dead or dying in the grass. Roman walked out into the moonlight. He didn't raise his gun. Doherty looked up, his face pale, realizing he had been played. "Castelli," he spat, blood dripping from his chin. "You set us up. Lorenzo." "Lorenzo is dead," Roman said smoothly, stopping 10 feet away. "And now, so is your family's hold on the docks, the casinos, and the city." Doherty let out a ragged, desperate laugh, raising his unjammed pistol. "I'll see you in hell, Roman." Doherty pulled the trigger. Roman had anticipated the shot. He twisted, the bullet grazing the Kevlar plating on his ribs, an inch from the old wound Savannah had patched up. In the same fluid motion, Roman raised his Sig Sauer and fired a single, perfect shot. The bullet caught Liam Doherty directly between the eyes. The Irish boss collapsed backward over the stone balustrade, tumbling into the dark rose bushes below. The war was over. 2 hours later, the estate smelled of bleach and heavy industrial cleaner, a scent that brought back a fierce wave of nostalgia for Savannah. Roman's men worked quickly, loading bodies into the unmarked vans and scrubbing the terracotta tiles until they shone. The police would never be called. The coroner would never see the bodies. In the underworld, ghosts simply vanished. The heavy steel door of the safe room hissed open. Savannah jumped up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Roman stood in the doorway. His Henley was torn, his face smeared with soot and dirt, and he looked utterly exhausted. But he was alive. She didn't think. She just ran to him. Savannah threw her arms around his thick neck, burying her face into his chest. Roman let out a deep, ragged groan, dropping his weapons to the floor so he could wrap his massive arms around her waist. He lifted her off her feet, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of vanilla and sugar that always clung to her skin. "It's over," Roman murmured against her skin. "Doherty is gone. You are safe." He set her down slowly, keeping his hands firmly on her wide hips. He looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the heavy, soft curves of her body, the flush of her cheeks, the fierce, beautiful light in her eyes. "I ruined your life, Savannah," he said quietly, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I brought fire and blood to your door. I wouldn't blame you if you walked out of these gates tomorrow and never looked back." Savannah looked at the terrifying, beautiful man who had bought her a building, protected her from assassins, and waged a war just to keep her safe. She thought about the endless, exhausting days at the iron skillet, serving men who looked right through her. Roman didn't look through her. He looked at her like she was the absolute center of his universe. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered, stepping closer, letting her heavy breasts press against his hard chest. "But I'm not a mob wife, Roman. I'm a chef. I feed people." Roman smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile that reached his eyes. "I know." 6 months later, the rain in Rittenhouse Square was entirely different from the greasy drizzle of South Philly. It was a crisp, clean autumn downpour that washed the cobblestone streets and reflected the warm, golden lights of Walnut Street's most exclusive new restaurant. Above the heavy oak double doors, a custom-forged iron sign hung elegantly. The Iron Rose. Inside, the restaurant was completely packed. There was a 6-month waiting list for a table. The interior was a masterpiece of exposed brick, crushed velvet booths, and low, intimate lighting. But the real magic was in the kitchen. Savannah stood at the pass, wearing a custom-tailored, pristine white chef's coat that hugged her thick curves perfectly. She wiped a smudge of flour from her cheek as she inspected a plate of braised short ribs over truffle risotto. "Table 4 needs this on the fly, Hector," Savannah called out to her head prep cook, who had been heavily compensated to follow her to the new establishment. "Yes, chef," Hector shouted back. Savannah turned around to grab a clean towel and nearly collided with a massive, immaculately dressed wall of a man. Roman was leaning against the stainless steel prep table, wearing a charcoal brioni suit, completely ignoring the chaotic hustle of the kitchen around him. 2 heavily armed men in suits stood discreetly by the back delivery doors, blending perfectly into the shadows. "You're in my way, Castelli," Savannah scolded playfully, though a warm flush crept up her neck at the way his dark eyes devoured her. Roman reached out, his large hand wrapping around her thick waist, pulling her flush against him. He didn't care that 20 kitchen staff members were watching. "I own the building, Gatina," Roman murmured, leaning down to press a soft, possessive kiss against her neck. "I can stand wherever I want." "You bought the building," she corrected, tapping his chest with her wooden spoon. "But I run the kitchen, and if you ruin my service, I'm cutting you off." Roman chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated against her chest. He stepped back, his eyes full of absolute, wavering adoration. "Whatever you say, boss." As Roman walked out of the kitchen to take his permanent booth in the corner of the dining room, Savannah looked around. She had lost her father's crumbling diner, but she had gained an empire. She was heavy, she was loud, and she was fiercely loved by the most dangerous man in Philadelphia. The underworld was full of monsters, but as Savannah plated another dish, she smiled. Sometimes, the monsters were exactly what you needed to build a beautiful life. Savannah thought she was just a curvy waitress, scrubbing a stranger's blood off her diner floor. But she ended up claiming the fiercely guarded heart of Philadelphia's most dangerous mafia boss. From the terrifying ashes of the iron skillet rose the Iron Rose, and an unbreakable love story forged in Phila. Bullets and absolute loyalty. If you were captivated by Savannah and Roman's gritty, high-stakes romance, hit that like button and share this incredible story of survival with your friends. Make sure to smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling, heart-pounding audio dramas. Drop a comment below to let us know your favorite plot twist, and we will see you in the next video.